Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single engagement but a continuous, grueling struggle that spanned the entirety of World War II, representing the longest, most complex naval campaign in human history. To understand the invisible war beneath the waves, one must first grasp the existential stakes involved for the Allied powers. For Great Britain, an island nation utterly dependent on overseas imports for food, raw materials, and military hardware, the Atlantic was not merely a geographic barrier but a vital carotid artery. If the German Kriegsmarine could sever this artery, the British Isles would be starved into submission, effectively ending the war in Europe before the United States could fully mobilize its industrial might. This conflict was characterized by a rapid, lethal evolution of technology and tactics, a secret war of codes and ciphers, and a psychological endurance test for the mariners who operated in the freezing, unforgiving environment of the North Atlantic. The strategic foundation of the German campaign was the tonnage strategy, formulated by Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of the U-boat fleet, Befehlshaber der U-Boot. Donitz recognized that Germany did not need to destroy the Royal Navy in a traditional surface fleet engagement like the Battle of Jutland. Instead, the Kriegsmarine needed only to sink merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. By maintaining a consistent rate of destruction, the Germans hoped to reduce the total available Allied shipping volume below the danger line required to sustain the British population and war effort. In the early years of the war, this strategy appeared terrifyingly viable. The German U-boats, particularly the Type 7 and Type 9 variants, were not true submarines in the modern sense but rather submersible torpedo boats. They spent most of their time on the surface where they were faster and more maneuverable, submerging only to evade detection or to deliver a killing blow. The early phase of the war, often referred to by German crews as the first happy time, Die glückliche Zeit, saw U-boats operating with near impunity. The British had entered the war with a misplaced confidence in ASDIC, the early form of sonar, believing it had rendered the submarine obsolete. However, ASDIC was only effective against submerged targets. Donitz countered this by developing Wolfpack, tactics, where U-boats would patrol in long lines to find a convoy, then congregate and attack simultaneously on the surface at night. In the darkness, the low-slung silhouettes of the U-boats were nearly invisible to the lookouts on merchant ships and escort vessels, and their surface speed allowed them to outrun many of the older corvettes and converted trawlers that made up the initial escort groups. The carnage was immense. During 1940 and 1941, hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping were sent to the bottom of the ocean every month, leaving the surface littered with oil slicks, debris, and the desperate survivors of the merchant navy. The technical war beneath the surface was a constant cycle of measure and countermeasure. As the British improved their escort tactics and began to equip ships with early radar, the U-boats were forced to innovate. One of the most significant developments was the introduction of the Matox radar warning receiver, which allowed U-boats to detect the pulses of British airborne radar and dive before the aircraft could locate them. This cat-and-mouse game extended to the very physics of the ocean. Allied scientists developed HUF-DUF, high-frequency direction finding, which allowed escort ships to triangulate the position of a U-boat by intercepting its radio transmissions, even if they couldn't decode the message itself. This meant that the very act of a U-boat reporting a convoy's position, essential for the Wolfpack tactic, often became its death warrant. Central to the invisible war was the silent struggle occurring at Bletchley Park. The German naval Enigma code, particularly the M4, four-rotor version used by the U-boat fleet, was significantly more complex than the versions used by the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe. For long periods of the war, the Atlantic was dark to Allied intelligence. The breakthrough often came not just through mathematical genius but through physical pinches, the capture of codebooks and Enigma machines from sinking U-boats. The capture of U-110 by HMS Bulldog in May 1941 provided Alan Turing and his team with the keys to the inner sanctum of German naval communications. When Bletchley Park could read the U-boat signals, the Admiralty's submarine tracking room could reroute convoys around the known patrol lines, effectively winning battles without a single shot being fired. Conversely, when the Germans added a fourth rotor or changed their weather codes, Allied losses spiked instantly as convoys sailed blindly into waiting traps. The geography of the Atlantic created a lethal obstacle known as the Mid-Atlantic Gap, or the Black Pit. This was a region in the center of the ocean that was beyond the reach of land-based Allied aircraft. Within this gap, U-boats could operate on the surface with relative safety, coordinating their attacks without fear of aerial bombardment. Closing this gap was perhaps the single most important operational goal of 1942 and 1943. The solution was threefold: the development of very long-range, VLR, aircraft like the B-24 Liberator, the introduction of the Lee Light, a powerful searchlight that allowed aircraft to surprise U-boats on the surface at night, and the construction of small, escort carriers, CVEs, that could travel with the convoys and provide a mobile airfield in the middle of the ocean. By 1943, the tide began to turn in what is known as Black May. During this month, the convergence of improved radar, centimetric radar which the MATOCs could not detect, better escort training, the closure of the Mid-Atlantic Gap, and the breaking of the M4 Enigma code resulted in the destruction of 41 U-boats. The loss rate became unsustainable for the Kriegsmarine. Donitz was forced to temporarily withdraw his boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging that the Allies had gained the upper hand. The Invisible War had shifted from a German offensive to a desperate Allied hunt. The U-boats were no longer the predators, they were the prey, hunted by specialized, hunter-killer groups led by aggressive commanders like Frederick Johnny Walker, who utilized sophisticated tactics like the creeping attack to pin down and destroy submerged U-boats over several hours. The human cost of this campaign was staggering. The merchant navy suffered a higher proportional casualty rate than any of the armed services. To be a merchant sailor was to face the constant threat of a torpedo strike, often followed by a slow death in the freezing waters or a fiery end in an oil-slicked sea. On the German side, the statistics were even more grim. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, nearly 30,000 never returned. A 75% fatality rate, the highest of any branch of any military in the war. These men lived in cramped, foul-smelling cylinders, breathing recycled air, enduring the terrifying clanging of depth charges that threatened to crush their hulls like eggshells, all while hunting an enemy they often never saw until the moment of the strike. Even in the final years of the war, the technical race continued. The Germans introduced the snorkel, allowing U-boats to run their diesel engines while submerged, and developed the acoustic torpedo, which homed in on the sound of an escort ship's propellers. The Allies responded with Foxer noisemakers towed behind ships to distract the torpedoes. Toward the very end, Germany launched the Type 21 Elektroboot, a revolutionary submarine designed to operate almost entirely submerged with high underwater speeds. Had these vessels been produced in significant numbers earlier, they might have restarted the crisis in the Atlantic. However, by 1945, the Allied grip on the seas and the skies, combined with the collapse of German industry under strategic bombing, ensured that the Invisible War was won. The legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic remains a testament to the intersection of industrial capacity, scientific innovation, and raw human endurance. It was a war won in the laboratories of Bletchley Park and the shipyards of the United States, where Liberty ships were being built in as little as 5 days, as much as it was won on the waves. Winston Churchill famously remarked that, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." This fear was justified. The Atlantic was the foundation upon which all other Allied victories were built. Without the successful defense of the Atlantic lifelines, the liberation of Europe, the D-Day landings, and the ultimate defeat of the Third Reich would have been logistically impossible. The war beneath the Atlantic was a silent, cold, and relentless struggle that determined the fate of the Western world. The complexity of the U-boat war also lay in the nuances of logistics and the tonnage math that dictated high-level strategy. Every tank sent to North Africa, every gallon of aviation fuel for the RAF, and every crate of sea rations for American troops had to cross the Atlantic. The Germans realized that they didn't need to sink every ship, they just needed to sink enough to create a bottleneck that would paralyze Allied operations. In 1942, during Operation Drumbeat Paukenschlag, U-boats moved to the eastern seaboard of the United States, taking advantage of the lack of coastal blackouts and the unorganized American defenses. Tourists on Florida beaches could literally watch merchant ships burning on the horizon. This period demonstrated that even the most powerful industrial nation was vulnerable if it could not secure its coastal waters. The transition from 1942 to 1943 marked the true pivot point of the war. The introduction of the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar allowed escort ships to fire projectiles ahead of the vessel, rather than dropping depth charges off the stern. This was crucial because it allowed the escort to maintain sonar contact with the submarine throughout the attack. Previously, when a ship sailed over a U-boat to drop depth charges, the turbulence of its own wake would blind its sonar at the most critical moment. The Hedgehog, combined with the arrival of the Squid mortar later in the war, meant that once a U-boat was detected, its chances of survival dropped precipitously. Furthermore, the role of the Royal Canadian Navy, RCN, cannot be overstated. Starting the war with only a handful of ships, the RCN expanded at a rate virtually unmatched by any other navy, eventually taking responsibility for a huge portion of the North Atlantic escort duties. The grueling Newfoundland to Derry run became the backbone of the convoy system. These sailors faced not only the U-boats but the Great Western Ocean itself, gales that could rip heavy machinery off decks, ice that could capsize a small corvette by making it top-heavy, and the constant, soul-crushing fatigue of weeks at sea in cramped quarters. In the final analysis, the invisible war beneath the Atlantic was a total war in every sense. It blurred the lines between civilian and combatant, between scientist and soldier. It was a conflict where a breakthrough in a mathematics classroom in England could be as lethal as a torpedo, and where the courage of a merchant stoker in the engine room of a slow-moving freighter was as vital as the leadership of an admiral. When the U-boats finally received the order to surrender in May 1945, they emerged from the depths as ghosts of a fleet that had come closer to changing the course of history than perhaps any other single arm of the German military. The silence that returned to the Atlantic was not just the end of a battle, but the restoration of a lifeline that had survived the greatest challenge ever posed to the freedom of the seas. The evolution of the Wolfpack tactics also provides a fascinating study in command and control. Admiral Donitz, operating from his headquarters in Lorient and later Berlin, maintained an iron grip on his captains. This centralization was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed for the rapid concentration of forces when a convoy was spotted, but it also necessitated constant radio communication. This radio chatter was the Achilles heel that Allied intelligence exploited. The invisible war was thus a struggle between the German desire for centralized tactical control and the Allied mastery of signals intelligence and direction finding. Each U-boat that signaled its success or requested instructions was essentially illuminating its position on a map in London. As the war progressed into 1944 and 1945, the U-boats became increasingly marginalized, but they never ceased to be a threat. The Schnorkel boats were much harder to detect from the air, forcing the Allies to rely more heavily on surface sonar and magnetic anomaly detectors. The psychological pressure on Allied crews remained high until the very last day of the war, as the Lone Wolf U-boats continued to stalk the coastal waters of the UK and the US. Even in the final weeks, ships were being sunk, a reminder that the Atlantic was never truly safe until the German surrender was signed. The sheer endurance of the U-boat arm, despite horrific losses, speaks to the intense indoctrination and the perceived importance of their mission within the German hierarchy. To look at the Atlantic today is to look at a vast graveyard. Thousands of ships and tens of thousands of men lie on the ocean floor, preserved by the cold and the dark. The wrecks of the U-boats and the merchantmen they sank serve as a permanent monument to the invisible war. This conflict taught the world that command of the sea is not just about having the biggest battleships, but about the seamless integration of technology, intelligence, and logistical endurance. The lessons learned in the Atlantic, about the importance of convoys, the necessity of air cover, and the power of code breaking, continue to influence naval strategy in the modern era. The war was invisible because its most decisive moments happened in the depths of the ocean, in the silent halls of intelligence centers, and in the private fears of the men who sailed. It was a war of shadows, but its outcome was the light of liberation for a continent. The technological arms race also saw the birth of early electronic warfare. The Germans developed bold canisters, chemical agents that produced clouds of bubbles to mimic the sonar reflection of a submarine, acting as a decoy. The Allies countered by training sonar operators to distinguish between the hard echo of a steel hull and the soft echo of a bubble cloud. This level of technical sophistication was unprecedented in naval history. Every aspect of the environment, from the thermal layers of the water, which could bend sonar waves and create blind spots where U-boats could hide, to the salinity of the sea, became a factor in the life or death struggle. The Invisible War also had profound geopolitical consequences. It forced a level of cooperation between the United States, Great Britain, and Canada that would lay the groundwork for the NATO alliance. The pooling of scientific resources, such as the Tizard mission which brought British radar secrets to America, accelerated technological progress by decades. The Battle of the Atlantic was the ultimate test of the special relationship and the collective industrial capacity of the Western democracies. In the end, the U-boats were defeated by a combination of superior math, superior production, and a relentless refusal to let the lifeline be broken. The Atlantic remained an Allied lake, and through it, the tools of victory were delivered. Expanding on the specific types of U-boats, the Type 7 was the workhorse of the fleet. It was small, cramped, and had limited range, but it was highly maneuverable and could dive quickly. The Type 9 was larger, intended for long-range missions to the South Atlantic or the Indian Ocean, but it was slower to submerge and more easily detected by radar. By the mid-war period, the Germans were also experimenting with milch cows, Type 14, specialized supply U-boats that carried extra fuel and torpedoes to replenish the combat boats at sea. This allowed the wolf packs to stay on station for much longer periods. The Allies prioritized the destruction of these milch cows, knowing that without them, the U-boat fleet's operational reach would be severely curtailed. The psychological atmosphere inside a U-boat during a depth charge attack is one of the most harrowing subjects of military history. The crew had to remain perfectly silent to avoid detection by Allied hydrophones. They would sit in total darkness to conserve battery power, listening to the ping of the escort's sonar getting louder and more frequent. Then came the explosions, shockwaves that could shatter light bulbs, burst pipes, and send rivets flying like shrapnel through the hull. The smell of chlorine gas from damaged batteries, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the mounting pressure of the water outside created a literal pressure cooker of stress. That men could endure this for weeks on end, knowing that their chances of survival were slim, remains one of the most somber reflections on the nature of duty and discipline in the Second World War. In summary, the Battle of the Atlantic was the definitive, invisible war. It was won not through a single climactic clash, but through the steady accumulation of small advantages, a slightly better radar, a more efficient convoy pattern, a lucky capture of a codebook, and the tireless work of shipyards and sailors. It was a war of attrition where the stakes were the survival of Western civilization. When we analyze the details of this conflict, we see the blueprint for modern high-tech warfare, a world where information is as powerful as ammunition and where the unseen is often the most dangerous threat of all. The victory in the Atlantic ensured that the arsenal of democracy could reach the front lines, making the eventual triumph of the Allies an inevitability rather than a possibility. Would you like me to continue with a deeper dive into the specific cryptographic breakthroughs or the evolution of the Liberty ship production?